Alrighty, I'm going to get started at least with the introduction so I don't take too much of Marshall's time. Welcome back. If you're new to us, this is our Wildfire seminar series for winter quarter. I'm glad to have you here. I'd like to acknowledge the Bill Lane Center, the Woods Institute, and Stanford Sustainability Data Science for graciously providing some support so we could put on this, I think, really great seminar series. I'm going to start promoting something that is my other hat. For those of you who are staff, faculty, and students, the Big Earth Hackathon Wildfire Challenge is coming up pretty soon during spring quarter. And so if you know students that are interested, if you're a student, please sign up. A couple key dates noted there. We're returning to a little bit more of a live format. We've got a former CAL FIRE chief coming on Saturday the 8th to inspire the participants, and we're going to have some workshops from Planet, Google Earth Engine, and MathWorks to try to help students with their projects. And for those of you just interested in what's going on, save the date. Friday, June 2nd, we'll have a project expo for the participants, and I'm sure you will be blown away by what is accomplished by them. But that being said, we are here this quarter talking about some policy and research issues related to wildland fires. And today's talk is going to be a great one. We have Marshall Burke in the house today. He's an associate professor in the Department of Earth System Science. He's also deputy director of the Center on Food Security and the Environment, and a center fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and co-founder of Atlas AI, a remote sensing startup. His research focuses on social and economic impacts of environmental change and on measuring and understanding economic development in emerging markets. He holds a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from UC Berkeley and a BA in international relations from Stanford. In the time I've known Marshall, which probably is a decade now, I've come to appreciate his gift of being able to bring the big picture of what's important to us as human beings, to scientists, and what's at stake in much of his diverse research portfolio. But I also am encouraged and inspired by his abilities to see the individuals impacted at a personal level, and he brings compassion, empathy, and energy into all the work he does. So with that being said, I'd like to turn over the reins to Marshall, who will talk a little bit about, or a lot probably, about air pollution trends in the US. Thanks for being here today, Marshall.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. Thanks for the really nice introduction. That was overly kind, but I appreciate it. So I can bring up some slides here. There we go. Folks, see that all right? All right. So let me start by thanking a number of people in my research group who I have had the good fortune of working with on this, including some of whom are here. Marissa, Sam, Jessica, Jeff, Minghao, Carlos, and many others in my own group who have really been instrumental, I think, in pushing our research forward in terms of understanding what I want to talk about today, which is the contribution of wildfire smoke to broader air quality trends, the impact that is having on health outcomes, and then hopefully we will touch on some policy implications throughout. I'm an economist, and so I am very used to getting interrupted in talk, so hopefully folks will stop me or interrupt me at literally any point if I say something that doesn't make sense, which is likely, or I say something they disagree with. So please interrupt me at any point. Okay, let me try to set some context here. A big jumping off point for us and a big motivation for thinking about this issue is wildfires in the broader context of air quality trends in the US. So here's a plot of trends in PM2.5, ambient PM2.5 concentrations around the contiguous US. You can see the US average there on the left, and then regional trends there on the right. And if you sort of blur your eyes and let the data wash over you, what you see is really remarkable improvements in air quality throughout the US for most of the last 2 decades. So we started monitoring PM2.5 concentrations in earnest around 2000 when they were added to regulations of air quality under updates to the Clean Air Act. So since 2000, we've had good monitoring, and through about 2015, as you can see on the left, our monitors showed really steady improvements in air quality, declines in PM 2.5 concentrations. Then around 2015, throughout most of the country, these trends appeared to flatten out. So you can see them flattening out here in the south and the east. And then elsewhere, they appeared to start going up. So these red lines are heroic linear regression fits to very short time series. That's what they are. And so again, blur your eyes a little bit. You can see that these trends were steeply down and then either flat after about 2015 or increasing. So our question today is going to be, are wildfires to blame, or to what extent are wildfires to blame for this reversal in air quality trends, this unfortunate reversal in air quality trends? And then what are the implications of that? If wildfires are substantially to blame, where are they to blame? What impacts is that having, and what do we do about it? So here is, this is the wildfire seminar. So I assume everyone at least might think that wildfires are to blame. Here would be some evidence that wildfires could be playing a role. This is estimates of burned area. So there are many reasons to not like burned area as a measure of fire severity, but the amount of emissions are roughly linear in the amount of area burned. And so you burn more things, you get more emissions, you get more PM and other air pollutants. We've seen steady increases in burned area across the US, as well in California. So these are different time series back to the early 80s, roughly. A lot of year-to-year variation, as we know, driven by interannual variation in climate, which I'll show in a second. 2020 was a really off the charts year for us. 2021 was bad, and in 2022 we really dodged a bullet. It was a really dry year, and we got pretty lucky with low number of fire starts. But overall, this trend is steadily up, whether you look in the US or elsewhere. So we're getting a lot more fires, and a ton of research links these fires very closely to variability in climate. So a famous PNAS paper from about 5 years ago now, Abbotsoglu and Williams, showed a very strong coupling between fuel aridity across Western forests and burned area. Note the log scale on the y-axis here. So an exponential relationship between fuel aridity and the total number of acres burned, or a log linear relationship here between, again, fuel aridity and area burned. So in red here, forests are drying out, as we know. That is driven by a warming climate substantially. And so we're getting more and more years that are hot and dry that have more area burned. VPD, vapor pressure deficit, is one measure of fuel aridity. Here's the time series of vapor pressure deficit through 2021. And then here are the climate model estimates of how much VPD is likely to go up relative to past data by mid-century for different warming scenarios. And so the very dry years we got in the past few years are going to be below the mean VPD by mid-century, according to these climate models, right? So they are barely a taste of things to come in terms of how hot and dry our forests are likely to be by mid-century. Okay, so again, these increases in burned area and thus PM are in some sense not a surprise, and just extrapolating out the VPD trend suggests that they could continue absent additional intervention. Okay, importantly, and as folks know, and this has already been talked about in this seminar, Michael Warr gave a great talk on this, on the policy details, so I'll focus less on this. But we deal with wildfire pollution really differently than we deal with other air pollutants, right? So that long-term multi-decadal improvement in PM 2.5 concentrations were driven substantially by public policy, in particular the Clean Air Act and its subsequent amendments, which recognize that most emissions are anthropogenic and that local concentrations depend on local emissions. So if you can regulate local emissions, you can improve local concentrations. That's what the Clean Air Act did, and this was remarkably successful. Okay, wildfire is different in a bunch of ways. Number one, emissions are not that well correlated with local concentrations, as we'll show. They travel very far, often thousands of kilometers. And they are, in some sense, not directly anthropogenic in the sense that sometimes it's just lightning starting fires in forests. And so they tend to be exempted. Wildfire smoke events, as Michael talked about a few weeks back, tend to be exempted from the Clean Air Act. And so this is an important source of pollution that is not regulated, but it likely causes impacts. As Mary talked about last week, it has many health impacts, but we're not regulating it using our key, not currently regulating it using our key public policy instrument that we've used in the past to improve air pollution. So that could be a problem. And so that's something we want to think about. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, so my group is working with co-authors here in the, including Mary, including Michael Wara, on a set of studies to try to do the following. So number one is coming up with better measures of ambient wildfire smoke exposure. So this is not something we can just read directly off of monitors. We have to sort of infer the smoke contribution to total PM or to some other pollutant that we care about. So we're working on improved measures. Once we have those measures, we can ask questions like, how much has wildfire contributed to the PM trends that I showed you before? Who has it impacted most in thinking about exposures for different demographic or socioeconomic groups? We want to think about then, once we have these better measures, try to do population health or population economic studies to think about the broader health and economic impacts of this smoke exposure, and I'll show you a few great new results we have on that. I won't talk about today how smoke infiltrates ambient, so outdoor smoke infiltrates into indoor environments. This is a really important topic, something we've worked on in the past. I won't talk about it today. And finally, we want to use this to evaluate mitigation strategies. Again, will not be the focus of today, but something that folks in my group are thinking about. Okay, so again, my focus today will be on these top three red bullets. Okay, so let's think about number one, how do we measure wildfire smoke exposure? Here I'm using exposure epidemiologically incorrectly, as Carlos in my group likes to point out every time. Really, we're thinking about concentrations, right? What is the ambient concentration of key pollutants and how are they driven by changes in wildfire smoke? Concentration does not equal exposure. So again, I'm using this in the popular way, not in the scientifically correct way. Forgive me, Carlos. A traditional way to think about this problem is to use chemical transport models or various types of transport models. So these are physical and chemical models that take emissions as an input and then do a bunch of meteorology and chemistry on top of those inputs to change the primary emitted pollutants potentially into secondary emitted pollutants, and uses the meteorology to push them around and follow them through space and time. These are great tools. They are often very computationally expensive, and so they're hard to run repeatedly over broad spatial scales for all the tens of thousands of fires that have occurred in the US. And so we're going to take a different approach, and that approach is to try to use other remote sensing-based information, mainly from satellites, that will help us infer surface level concentrations of PM. We are not the first ones to work on this. Obviously, people have been using satellites to measure pollution and other things about the atmosphere for a long time. And the reason they've been doing that is because it works pretty well. So here's an image during one of the really bad fire days in California in 2020. This is Sentinel-2 image, European Space Agency. And hopefully on your screen, certainly on mine, you can see this really nasty swath of smokes sitting across California. And even visually, the smoke is very distinguishable from the clouds, right? It's sort of this dirtier color. And the basic rule in machine learning these days in computer vision, if you can tell the difference visually, you can train a computer to do so. And so our goal is to train a computer to do so. One of the tools we're going to lean on a lot is these smoke plumes that folks might have seen. This is actually a product put out by analysts at NOAA, where analysts literally go day by day looking at geostationary imagery from weather satellites and drawing on those imagery where the smoke plumes are, often multiple times per day. So these drawings aren't perfect, but they give us a very good initial start at where the smoke is likely to be. And then we can combine these plumes with other sources of satellite information to really hone in on the intensity or the density of that smoke in a given location. So that's going to be our basic strategy. First, to do that, though, we need some training data. We need to actually be able to train our model, right? So we have the satellite data, lots of inputs, that's great. we need to be able to predict something, and specifically what we want to predict is the amount of wildfire smoke derived PM 2.5 on the ground, right? So we're going to focus on PM 2.5. We want to isolate the wildfire contribution to that. And so we need some training data on the ground that accurately measures that. To do that, we're going to use the EPA monitors. There's a few thousand around the US. They report on daily or sometimes weekly timescale, but very high quality measurements around the US. And basically what we're going to do is in the ground data, try to separate out what came from wildfire smoke from what didn't come from wildfire smoke. The way we're going to do that is to lean very heavily on the plumes. So for any given station, what we can do is create a long-term running average of what the PM was in a given month on days when smoke was not overhead, days when basically the plumes told us there was no smoke overhead. So that gives us sort of a background level of PM. As I showed you before, that's mostly been going down around the country. And then we're going to call wildfire smoke the anomalous spikes above that background on days in which the satellite said there were plumes overhead, right? So we're leaning very heavily on the plumes. We're using the plumes to create this background level of non-smoke PM. And then we're saying when plumes are overhead and PM is anomalously high, we're going to attribute that PM to wildfires. And so that's sort of what this looks like. So black would be the total PM here. Blue is this sort of long-term seasonal running mean. And then red would be the inferred smoke PM from that estimate. And so you can see that it would attribute in this setting most of the spikes, not all of the spikes, right? We're subtracting off the sort of background bit over time, but during this 2020 event, right, it would attribute most of the anomalies to wildfire, which seems sensible. So that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to train machine learning models that hold out data, that are really careful about just training on some stations and then making predictions on stations that they have not seen, right? So this is called cross-validation. It's a really important approach for making sure that your model can accurately make predictions in areas where it has no data, right? And as you can see, we have a lot of stations around the country, but there's big holes. Nevada, not a lot of people in Nevada, but not a lot of stations either, right? So we want to basically be able to accurately fill in all the gaps, both temporally and spatially, in this station network. And we're going to use the satellites to do that. Okay, we're going to use a bunch of inputs. I'm going to not spend a lot of time on this. If folks want to talk about more sort of the input stack here, the machine learning approach, happy to do so. These are the inputs. We're predicting the station data I showed you before. We're cross-validating on held out data with the goal of predicting daily local level PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke. Okay, here's how the model does on held out data. So again, this is evaluated on stations that the model has not seen at all. It does pretty well. It explains almost 70% of the variation, the ground level daily variation, day-to-day variation in wildfire smoke as measured at the ground. So we think that's pretty good. This is state of the art as best we can tell compared to the existing literature. So we were pretty happy with this. I should note that this work was led by Marissa Childs, who was an EIPER student here, now doing her postdoc at Harvard, really talented student who responsible for all these beautiful graphs. So he explained roughly 2/3 of the variation, so that's quite good. Performance varies some, so we can study performance station by station. We tend to do really well in most of California, particularly in the smokier parts of California. We do quite well in the Northwest. And overall, we do better in places that have more smoke. Why is that? That often gives us more variation with which to train the model. So these models do better when you have more variation in the outcome that you're trying to predict. And a lot of the variation comes from Northern California, comes from the Pacific Northwest and the Rockies, and we tend to do pretty well there. We do less well in the desert. There's actually not, historically has not been that much smoke, and the year-to-year variance is really low. And so our models actually sort of struggle to predict variation in, say, in parts of Arizona. Throughout the northern Midwest and actually the East, we do pretty well as well. And I'll show you some animations. You actually do get a lot of smoke that's now blown into the East Coast. So it does give us some variation to predict, and we end up doing pretty well there. So again, across the board, in the most smoky areas, we tend to do pretty well. but parts of Southern California, parts of Arizona, the desert specifically, our models tend to struggle a little bit.
Hey, Marshall, can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Just
please,
to
go ahead.
clarify what you've just been talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm actually, you know, a fluid mechanician by training. So I'm just thinking about back to the physical transport models.
Yeah.
Are you saying that when you have a low R squared, a low variance explained, is that really meteorologically driven or is it data driven? Because to me, it seems like, what are the wind patterns that lead to such a strong signal on the East Coast, right? Most of our fires, we think, are on the West US.
Yep.
So is it saying that the winds and the jet stream are transporting most of the smoke to the East Coast, and there's only occasional blips of it going southwest, in the southwest, and to the south?
So this is just a statistical statement about how well our predictions match the observed. I think what you said there is an explanation for why our model might not be doing that well, is that we're poorly capturing. Either there's just not that much variation year to year or day to day down here, which is indeed what we see. So we're starting to get more fires in northern Arizona. Most of those actually tend to blow north during the main part of the season. And so down here in southern Arizona, you just have very, very few fire days. And so you're trying to predict a sort of a very rare event in those data, and our model just really struggles to do that.
Okay.
Maybe partly related to the meteorological phenomenon you mentioned. Yeah.
Thanks.
Just poorly captured.
One more quick clarification. This is Mary.
Yeah. Hey, Mary.
How far back do you look at the PM levels?
Yeah. So thanks for, I should have said that at the outset. Our plume data go back to 2006. So we're able to do this starting in January 2006. So we do it January 2006 through roughly present. The full grid of data we have right now through 2020, we're hoping to update it. I think Jessica's on the call. We're from Jessica to update it.
Okay.
So it's about 15 years.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd love to take it back further, but the plume data, which we rely on pretty heavily, only start in 2006.
Since we're asking questions, I have one. I used to
please.
live up in near Paradise, or in Paradise, and during the spring, the pine trees literally turn everything yellow with pollen.
Yeah.
So is that in this range of size, and is that a relevant thing to take account of, the variability with, you know, the time of the year?
Yeah, that's a great point. So we are very careful to take out seasonal average differences. So if you look in California and you look in the Central Valley, the worst air quality on average is in the winter, right? So PM is a lot worse in the winter than it is in the summer. We get more wildfires in the summer. So a naive model that didn't account for that seasonality would say wildfires are good for air quality because the wildfire season has lower PM on average than the winter. So, and Bill, to your point, there are other seasonally varying things that we really want to be careful about. So we don't compare then basically a January to a June. We just compare Junes to Junes and try to predict low PM Junes versus high PM Junes and say, okay, are wildfires correlated with the within month variation to account exactly for pollen or anthropogenic sources that tend to be high seasonally, dust sources, et cetera. Yeah, it's a great point.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I showed you the model. Now we can take it for a spin. So here are the predictions from February 2020, the daily predictions. Fires tend to start in the Southeast. The April, May is the sort of fire season in the Southeast, and you'll see the Rockies start to kick in, and then the West. So here we go, June, as we move into July, August, we get into the sort of apocalyptic period. Here we go, California kicking up. What's sort of cool here is and terrifying is you can sort of see the wind blowing it across. And again, this is just the model prediction, right? We haven't modeled the wind here in any physical way. The model is just sort of tracking the smoke as it's blown across. So I'll stop the animation here. But this gives you a sense of what the gridded output of the model looks like. We can go year by year, again, back to 2006, and show how the spatial average variation in the wildfire has changed over time. Again, if you sort of blur your eyes, you can see that the years are getting worse and worse. 2017 was pretty bad. 2018 was historically bad at the time. And then 2020 sort of blew the roof off what we were used to in California. 2021 actually on average across the West was worse than 2020. California was a little better in 2021. We don't have that full map yet, so I'm just going to armchair that, but this is getting substantially worse. The other thing we can look at is not just the annual averages, but the changes in extreme days. There's no obvious definition of extreme days. We can map this to AQI. What we did here is we just mapped it to sort of round numbers in the in concentration. So 50 micrograms, 100 micrograms, 200 micrograms. And we looked at the overall decadal change in the frequency of days above those somewhat arbitrary thresholds. So for the 50 microgram threshold, 15 years ago, about 5 million people were exposed to at least one day that was that bad. Now we see nearly 20 million people exposed to at least a day that was that bad. So a 4x increase in the number of people seeing at least one day that was that bad. And then as you crank up the threshold, the increase gets actually much larger. And that's because, so take the 200 microgram threshold. 15 years ago, basically nobody got a day that bad, right? A couple hundred people a year got a day that was really that bad. Our estimates would suggest. Now we get millions of people who have at least a day above 200 microgram. And so it's an insane percentage increase, right? Just basically from nothing up to millions of people exposed to these really, really bad days. So we're going to come back in a bit, if I don't waste too much time, and look at some health impacts of that using emergency department data in California. Okay. Finally, we can look at who's getting exposed. So we can couple our model predictions with census data on different demographic, racial, ethnic groups. We can do this by income. We can do it by race, ethnicity. What we have seen, and this is largely just a function of where people live in the country, we've seen the largest increase in exposure for Hispanic populations. This is driven, a lot by the Hispanic populations in California who have been seen very large increases. Black African-American populations have experienced much smaller increases, again, as a function of where different populations live. Interestingly, we see no differential change in exposure by income. And if anything, high income counties or census tracts have been slightly more exposed than lower income census tracts. So in some sense, this upends some of the normal environmental justice narratives we have around air pollution, which we tend to think of as highly differential by income. And often the racial patterns are certainly not what we see for wildfire smoke. So in some sense, wildfire smoke is a more evenly shared burden by income. And then the racial ethnic differences, I think, are different than many other types of air pollution that we're used to thinking about. Okay. So let's go back to the original motivation. So now we have a way to predict wildfire smoke around the country and over time. Let's go back to the original motivation, which was this overall decline in total PM 2.5. And we want to understand to what extent this overall decline was driven, the flattening, the stagnation, or the reversal of this decline was driven by increasing wildfire smoke. The challenge for us in doing this is our smoke model only predicts wildfire smoke. It doesn't predict total PM. So to be able to ask questions about total PM, we need to be able to measure it. And so again, we're just going to be able to use the station data to do that. So I'm not going to be able to give you an overall map with all the gaps filled in of the answer to this trend question. I'm only going to be able to answer it at the station data, at the station locations, but we got a lot of stations, so hopefully this is all right. So again, this is how we construct the smoke data. The total PM, we can just read off the station monitor. That's what it gives us. We can back out what the smoke PM is using the method I talked about before with the wildfire plumes. And then if you subtract that off from the total, you get the non-smoke PM. So the station, then we can use the station time series to construct a measure of total PM at each station, non-smoke PM at each station, and smoke PM at each station. And that's what we're going to use. Okay. I'll skip the boring statistical part on this. When did this reversal happen or this stagnation happen? So you can use statistical tests called these structural breaks tests to figure out, okay, when did this time series actually change? And sure enough, it gives you a number right around 2015, 2016, similar to what your eyeballs gives you. The math does the same. For For the days above 35 micrograms, so here we're going to use 35 micrograms as our extreme threshold. We're using that because it's a threshold used in EPA regulation, Clean Air Act regulation right now. So we're going to look at changes above that threshold, days above 35 micrograms. And those actually flattened out a little bit earlier and started to increase around 2010. So the annual stuff took a little longer to flatten out and reverse than the extreme days. So again, the question is, how much is this driven by wildfire smoke? And we're going to ask a few questions. So number one, I want to ask, are air quality gains, total PM, actually stagnating or beginning to reverse? We're going to study this at the state level. We're going to go state by state and basically do this analysis and say, okay, in each state, are these gains actually slowing down and or are they reversing? And that's a test on the black lines here. So the black lines here are going to be the total PM. Then we're going to ask, is wildfire smoke a cause of this stagnation or reversal? And then that's going to be a test on total PM versus non-smoke PM, right? And so if these two things are going in a different direction, or conversely, this and wildfire smoke are going in the same direction, that tells us something about wildfire's contribution to the recent trend. And so basically we can ask, okay, for the number of states where PM has slowed down or reversed, how many of them was wildfire a substantial influence? That's what we're going to ask. And we're going to do this state by state. Okay, so here are the state level trends. For 42 out of 48 states in the US, we see either a stagnation, that means a slowing down of progress, or a reversal, PM trends going up instead of down. So stagnation is a slowing, a reversal is it's now going up. So 25 stagnation states, 17 reversal states. This is just total PM, right? This is not thinking about wildfires. But in 42, so 88% of our contiguous US states, PM gains have slowed down or started to reverse. Okay, here is a Sankey plot or an alluvial plot that then divides that up into how wildfire has influenced it, right? So what we find here is that, in 33 out of those 42 states, wildfire has had a statistically significant influence in the recent period. So in 70% of the states where PM had slowed down or started to reverse, wildfire has a clear statistical fingerprint, has been a clear contributing cause to that stagnation or reversal. So that's most of them, right? 33 out of 42 states. In some states, in a handful of states, we can actually say statistically that wildfire has caused the reversal. So that reversal, the increase in wildfire smoke would not have happened were it not for wildfire smoke. In most of the other ones, it sort of just contributed to the flattening out or the reversal. It wasn't the only cause. Okay, how much did it contribute? So for those 33 states, we can calculate how fast in the blue was smoke going down before. We can contribute, how fast in the blue was total PM going down before. This was the decline, the annual change. This is the total change in PM over that period. We can compare that to the increase in wildfire smoke over the recent period, and we can take the ratio of the two. And taking the ratio then answers the question, how much of the previous decline has been erased by the recent increase in wildfire smoke? So again, how much of the recent wildfire smoke increase has eaten away at all that progress we made before? What percent has been erased by wildfire smoke? And across the states that we look at, about 20% has been erased of that remarkable progress we made since 2000. About 20% has been erased in the last 5 years from wildfire smoke. So that to us is a big number. In some states, it's substantially more. So a lot of states in the Northwest and even some in the Midwest, half of the progress was erased by wildfire smoke. And in some places, nearly all of the progress has been erased by wildfire smoke. These tend to be places where the previous progress wasn't that fast. These are places where the air quality was actually pretty clean to start with, places like Idaho. And then wildfires has substantially pushed up recent PM concentrations. And so have erased all the progress we made since 2000. So that seems bad. Smoke is sort of rapidly erasing progress, policy-driven progress we had made before for other sources of PM 2.5. Here's just the map. I'm going to skip through that. Are these trends likely to continue? And I am sorry, this is so blurry. So the previous slide argued that wildfires are increasingly contributing to wildfire trends. They are erasing previous progress. A natural question is this going to continue? Let me take a drink. I showed you before, excuse me. I showed you before that year-to-year variation in climate, and particularly measures of fuel aridity. Here, VPD is vapor pressure deficit, one of the main measures of the thirstiness of the air, that which is non-linearly related to temperature. So what we can do is, with our smoke measures, we can actually go back and relate year-to-year variation in our fuel aridity metric to our smoke measure, the thing we arguably care about, not to burned area, but to the actual smoke measure. And again, we see a very linear relationship between our fuel aridity metric and the log. So again, log linear relationship, the log of our smoke measure, right? So log linear relationship that tracks very closely the sort of burned area relationship I showed you before, maybe not a surprise. And then again, this is what I showed you before. So here's the May-October average VPD, and that thing's going to continue to go up, right? So again, these two basic relationships would suggest, if you can see my cursor, right, VPD down here is going to continue to go up. And unless something changes, that's going to likely increase the annual smoke PM. All the data we have would suggest that's going to be the case. So that wraps up the the exposure part of this, concentration part of this. Pardon me, Carlos. And unless folks have questions, I'm going to pivot to the health impacts part. Talk about that briefly. Take another drink. All right.
May I have a question?
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. I love your analyzing data. It was really amazing.
Okay, thanks.
I have a little question. How did you calculate the percentage of the progress? It was you calculate as a cumulative, or no, you just starting the starting point and ending point?
Yeah, so sorry, I went through that pretty quickly. So the calculation we did was to calculate through 2016, how much overall reduction did we get in total PM, right? What was the overall progress that I showed you on those plots before, right? What was that we saw those sloping down? What was the overall progress we got state by state, right? So we get a state level number and what the progress was. And then we look in the last 5 years and say, okay, how much has wildfire smoke pushed that back up, right? So how much of an increase in PM 2.5 have we gotten from wildfire smoke? And so we take the ratio of the increase in wildfire smoke to the total decrease in the previous period. And we're going to say the ratio of those two things is how much of the improvement has been eaten away by recent wildfire smoke changes. So that's the calculation. This paper's in review, so if there's a better way to do this, we're all ears. For sure.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Marshall, I have a question too.
Yeah, please, Bruce.
Did the trend in the background, it seemed like it was very flat. Even before, these recent trends. I'm just wondering, when did that flatten out? I mean, how did we already hit a point in which we were getting progress? Because that's one of the policy mechanisms would be to try to keep reducing the background PM 2.5. Have we flattened out for a reason? And when did that happen? Do you know?
We don't see any obvious. So here, let me actually go to the state by state, because this is going to be a better. So the blue here, Bruce, would be, so if you can see this, the blue would be our prediction of what would have happened absent wildfires. So basically in most of the East and the South, we see the blue sort of more or less continuing to decline. Maybe you could argue it's flattening out a little bit, which I think is sensible in the sense that we've, like, a lot of the low-hanging fruit for some of these pollutants has been taken care of. But we still would have seen declines in some places, right? So a lot of the Southeast, Arkansas, Missouri, like actually pretty linear declines in a lot of these places. So I think your point is right, that there could still be sort of headroom to reduce the background. That is, in other places, that's not necessarily what we saw. It looks pretty flat in California, pretty flat in Oregon and parts of Washington. So I don't have a good story of what would explain the differences in the background trends across places. That's not something we really have much to say on.
But
It's a
presumably,
good
if we
question.
were to do more prescriptive burns, that would go into the background, right?
Well, that would be an important accounting question. Where should we count that?
Right.
I would, yeah. Where should we count that? I don't know. I don't know that should go into the background.
Okay.
Depends on how we want to regulate it. If we're going to regulate it under the Clean Air Act, which we do, yeah. I mean, so right now it would go into the EPA's calculation of the regulatable total PM. It would not go into our background currently. We just don't have that much prescribed burning. Most of the prescribed burns that we have in the West don't generate even enough smoke to show up in the smoke plumes. So they're not contributing to either the background or the smoke PM in these data. If we scaled up by an order of magnitude, that'll obviously change. And so then your point is really important. I don't know where those totals will go or should go.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let me talk quickly about work trying to then link these smoke exposure data to data we have on emergency department visits in California. So this is work led very capably by Sam Hefneal. This is also quite new. So excited for any feedback on this. So we have the universe of ED visits. So every single ED visit except to the VA in California. So this is it's called the near universe of daily ED visits, starting in 2016 through 2017. So we don't have the recent most smoky year, so that's important, but we have 11 years of daily ED visit data. It's geo-referenced at the hospital level, and we know the location of the hospital. We also know the zip code, the resident zip code. So if you show up to the ED, I know where you said you lived, and so we're going to measure exposure at the zip code of residence. Okay, I won't go through the statistics here, but basically, we don't want to compare Stanford Hospital to Fresno Regional. I don't know the names of hospital in Fresno. Those hospitals could be really different wildfire smoke exposure, different rates of ED visit, et cetera. What we want to do is compare Stanford Hospital to itself over time as wildfire fluctuates and ask, in days when we have a lot more wildfire smoke, do we see increases in ED visits? We want to take care of seasonality because we see strong seasonality and some reasons for people to show up to the ED. You get way more poisonings in the summer. You get way fewer respiratory ED visits in the summer. So the background rate is quite seasonal. So again, we want to compare a June at Stanford Hospital to a June at Stanford Hospital, where one June is quite smoky and the other is not smoky. So basically the whole approach here is to really try to isolate the contribution of wildfire smoke to the ED visits and strip out all the other background reasons that ED visits could be changing. Okay, so that's the fancy regression here. Here's what's remarkable. Here's the relationship between daily PM exposure and daily ED visits. This is the cumulative effect after 7 days. What's really important in doing this is studying the effect not just on the day of smoke, but on many days after. You might imagine that, okay, if a really bad day, I'm not going to go today, but I'll go tomorrow, right? Maybe you can delay it. So you want to think about the potential lagged effects. So here we're looking at the sum of the total change in visits across the week after a really bad day. And at low levels of smoke exposure, up to about 10 to 20 micrograms, we see increases in ED visits. And then above about 25 micrograms, we actually start to see declines in total ED visits. And at really bad days, we see substantial declines in ED visits. So declines of something, this is like a 7% decline in the total number of people showing up to the ED. So on the face of it, it looks like really bad wildfire days are good for ED visits. They reduce total ED visits.
Is that because people just don't want to go out?
Yeah, let me show you. Okay, so we are puzzled by this, and this paper, thanks to Sam, because he's so careful, this paper took a very long time because we're like, this cannot be right. How is it the case that our worst wildfire smoke days, we see fewer total ED visits? So what's going on? We have other work that shows using the mobility data, so the cell phone data that tracks where you go. We know that people's mobility, their behavior, responds a lot to wildfire smoke. In particular, on really bad wildfire days, people stay at home. They do not leave their house. And not like everyone stays at home, but substantial percentages of people who normally would leave their house do not leave their house on an extreme wildfire smoke day. And that is increasing in the severity of wildfire smoke. So we can see that in the mobility data. So we have the same hypothesis here. Okay, maybe this is driven by what economists would call avoidance behavior. People just avoiding the nuisance by staying at home. And maybe that could reduce then total ED visits because it reduces your wildfire smoke exposure, but you're also not getting in your car, right? Car accidents are a big source. Maybe, any other thing that could hurt you when you're outside your house, you're less exposed to, and that might reduce ED visits. That is indeed what we see. Okay, so let me start with respiratory. So the outcome that we think should be most coupled to the pollutant is very strongly increasing in wildfire smoke. So the total respiratory ED visits goes up substantially. And if you look at asthma on one of these bad days, and these aren't even the worst days, right? This is like a 50 microgram day. Asthma visits roughly double to the ED. So this is sort of what you'd expect, okay? Respiratory visits on the whole are a small part of total ED visits. Most ED visits are coded as symptoms, which is sort of a broad class of diagnoses where people show up and say, my head hurts, my stomach hurts, I have shortness of breath. Shortness of breath as a symptom goes up substantially. A lot of people coming in saying they have shortness of breath. Many fewer people coming in saying they have abdominal pain. So what does that likely mean? That likely means maybe you do have abdominal pain, but you're less likely to go to the ER when it's really smoky out. You're going to stay home. The overall effect is to reduce the number of people showing up with symptoms. And this is the largest class. This with accidental injuries are the two largest classes of diagnoses that account for most of the overall ED visits. Accidental injuries go way down. Fractures go down, superficial injuries go down. So again, this is consistent with you staying home and not going out to playing baseball and breaking your leg or getting in a car wreck, right? So the avoidance behavior is generating a substantial decline in these other sources of ED visits. Circulatory, we actually see basically nothing, maybe small increases, but large uncertainty. So there is no clear relationship between cardiovascular outcomes and smoke exposure in our data, which I think is interesting. The net effect of these, though, because symptoms and accidental injuries are so much more common, is to generate this decline, this overall net decline at high PM levels. Okay, what's the overall effect of this? And then I'll finish up. The total effect, if you think about all types of smoke days, and you sum up the effects on moderate days, and you sum up the effects on really bad days, the total effect is still positive. And that is because we get so many more moderate days than we do really bad days, at least historically, right? This gray thing down here at the bottom, if you can see my cursor, is the distribution of days at each of these smoke PM levels. We get a lot of really low smoke days. And so we get an increase in ED visits on those smoke days, and that substantially outweighs the decrease we get on much rarer extreme days. And so then we can go across California and calculate, okay, how many excess ED visits do we get as a result of smoke exposure? And in some years, recall, these are not nearly as smoky as the more recent years. Those aren't in our data. But in the smokiest year in our data, 2017, we attribute 8,000 additional ED visits to wildfire smoke. So a substantial increase in total ED visits just from wildfire smoke. Okay. I'm going to wrap up. We've got these new, we think, very good estimates of gridded wildfire smoke. They can be used for, we think, a bunch of downstream applications, understanding who's exposed to what, understanding health impacts. We've used them to study educational impacts. Jeff Wynn and my group has a great paper on that. We're looking at mortality impacts now. We're trying to understand what species are in the wildfire smoke to think about toxicity using all these data. So these data are gridded, they're public, please use them. Please reach out if anyone wants to collaborate on this. So that's number one. Number two, it looks like using these data, wildfire smoke is increasingly central to air quality trends throughout a lot of the US. The fingerprints are visible not just in the West, but in much of the upper Midwest and in select states elsewhere in the country. So again, 33 states, we have a statistically significant fingerprint of wildfire smoke. In many states, that effect is not only statistically significant, it's also quite meaningful. So again, on average, wildfire smoke has eaten away 20% of the progress we had made before, and that's happened in just 5 years. So 15 years of progress eaten away in 5 years, 20% of it eaten away in 5 years. And finally, using the ED data, we see overall total increases when you add up over mild and really bad days, but you see substantial changes in behavior on these really bad days that really sort of affect the overall social response to these in interesting ways. Making precise welfare statements about the social cost at really extreme days is hard. Economists, I think, are willing to often push this pretty far. So basically what our data could suggest is wildfire smoke is so bad. On a normal day, I'm willing to go out and break my leg because I love playing soccer so much, right? That's the cost I'm willing to incur. Wildfire smoke is so bad that I'm not even willing to incur that cost, right? So my value of a clean air day is like my willingness to go out and break my leg, something like that. We haven't pushed that interpretation that far, but would love your feedback on how to think about the overall welfare effects. So I will stop there. And again, thank everyone in my group for all their important contribution here. So thanks, everybody.
Marshall, that was fantastic. I hadn't been keeping up with what you've been doing. That was just really a great view of what you've been doing. I have questions I can ask you offline, and Ross has a question. I know we're short on time, so I definitely want to get to who's here.
Really quick, do you think those visits are deferred by the extreme smoke days rather than just don't occur?
Great question. So we can run the lags out to, we've run them out 6 weeks. So basically you can look for the next 6 weeks. After a really bad day, you look for the next 6 weeks. So our hypothesis was the same. Maybe they just get deferred, but even out 6 weeks, we see no evidence of deferment. So these are literally ones that were taken off the ledger. They didn't happen.
Thank you.
Bruce, is that a hand raising? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. That's all right. I can't, for some reason, I'm having trouble raising my hand. Now I know. I raised my hand. There you go.
Bruce.
Yeah, two things, just suggestions. One is, I think it's going to be really fascinating to look at 2000, 2001, because that's when people were masking for other reasons. And it might actually change the number of people that went outside, so it might change the accident rate. I don't know, although people weren't driving very much. So, but it'd be interesting. You do have a natural experiment because there were more people buying the air pollution machines, at least in Northern California, and also wearing the masks.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting to look at. I think it's going to be great when you get that data. And then, you know, I do think that, since you can link this to socioeconomic data, I'm wondering whether the hospital visits, this is going to give you some insight on the question of the indoor air exposure, because it's quite possible that in the poorer areas, you will still find hospital visits are different. The rate of going to hospital visits during those events will be greater in the lower economic areas. Could be offset by the fact that they're out working. So, you know, you're going to have a lot of conflation there, but you still might find differences socioeconomically in terms of the hospital rates in that period. And you can do that because you've got the linkage to the GIS linkage to the tracks.
Yeah, so I didn't mention that. So Sam, of course, had the same idea as you, Bruce, and looked at that. We looked at it both in terms of income and in terms of the percent of people who are actually insured. And actually what we found is that the people who are least likely to be insured are the ones that are driving a substantial part of that decline. And that is, so for reasons likely unrelated to wildfires, the people who tend to use the ED for their primary care, right? And so actually the largest decline we saw was for that population. If you look at the asthma signature, so your hypothesis would be, I think, more around the asthma, like the respiratory
right.
outcome. There we do not see differential response by income. So I think somewhat, which we actually expected, right? For the reasons you just pointed out. We do not yet see, again, this is just data through 2017, right? We don't yet see a clear income signature in the asthma response.
Great. Mary has a question too, and people can leave it when they want. And I don't know what Marshall's timeline is. We're almost at 1:30, but Mary has a question at least. So
Yeah, I'll be
hope
really
Marshall
quick.
can answer that. Yeah.
That was great, Marshall.
Thanks. Mary.
I had a question. Did you look at differences in age groups for some of the outcomes, especially respiratory?
Yes. And that is a figure in the paper that I
Okay.
can send you, and I'm going to screw it up. The short
Okay.
answer is yes. What we found, I can't remember. Instead of armchairing it, let me look it up in paper. I should know
That's
that.
bad.
Sam here. Sam, are you here? Yeah, Sam's
Yeah,
here.
we see a
Okay,
lot
yeah.
of increases in asthma for young children, but then a lot of the declines are actually coming from people like 18 to 45.
Okay.
So we
Interesting.
see the increases among the children, but the decreases among the adult, but not the oldest adults population.
That's right.
And then
Thanks, Sam.
for the symptoms, did you use like ICD-10 codes that were non-specific for shortness of breath or whatever? Is that
Yeah, we used ICD-9 because our data started in
Okay.
2006,
Okay.
but same idea, and we use the HCAI groupings that they use for summarizing their data.
Okay, great.
And then we mapped ICD-9 and ICD-10.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, unless there's a pressing question, I'm going to wrap it up there, but I also like to give a quick promo for next week's talk. It's going to be very different in flavor, but I hope you'll join us. We have last year's, one of the last year's winning teams from the Wildfire Challenge, and they're going to talk about NFTs as a creative solution to many of the issues related to wildfires and land management. So I hope you'll come next week. It's a very different flavored talk, but I think you'll be inspired by what these two students came up with last year. So please join us next week. Thanks again for everyone's attention. Thank you again to Marshall. Let's keep this going. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, everybody. See you.